Good morning, friends, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to meet you again, many of you again, and many of you for the first time. I have to apologize first because 2 weeks ago I stumbled over a stone and my right toes bones fractured. So I almost gave up to come here. But I'm an old man, but I still have the strength to recover. And so I began to walk. So at the last moment, I decided to come. That means that I had no time to prepare a paper. Therefore, what I am going to do is a little bit of a chat, chatting about this big theme. The theme itself is so important that it cannot be treated through chats, but there's no help because I have no paper. Decolonizing the Mind Beyond Nationalism and Globalization is the title we are discussing, and that this is a very, very important title. It's not just about decolonization, but the decolonization of the mind. That is, I think, is a point. Well, what do I mean as a Japanese to discuss this topic? Decolonizing the mind. Whose mind? To me, it means how the Japanese can decolonize their mind. And that is a very, very crucial issue, directly linked to the present-day politics of Japan, which is becoming more and more right-wing, more and more forgetful of the past, more and more yearning for the glory of the past as Japanese empire. Abe is the name of the person symbolizing this terrible thrust toward right, which actually started in the middle of 1990s. For many years, for decades after Japan was defeated in 1945, Japan more or less was relatively harmless country. Relatively. It was harmful, yet compared with the previous history, we didn't make war. At least in that sense, it was a sort of period of peaceful development. Japan is known as the first Asian country to modernize through social change, which was very profound. The whole class of samurai, numbering about 500,000, 5 million, were wiped out. So it was a revolution of a sort, not like the so-called bourgeois revolution, yet it was a great, great big social change. And it was the beginning of the building of an empire of its own. And I'm not going into history, but immediately after the change of the government, beginning of modernization, Japan began to expand outward, conquering Okinawa, conquering Ainu indigenous population in Hokkaido, northern part, and having ambition on Korea, and started a war with China, Qing dynasty, and then with Russia. The stake in the two cases was the control of Korea and northeastern part of China. So I was born in 1931, 4 days before the outbreak of the Manchurian incident that led to the conquest of the northeastern part by the Japanese military clique, who did it without the permission of the central government, and then justified by the government. And aggression and expansion continued that way. Always the thrust and motivation to expand coming first, and then it was approved later by the official government and official, the parliament and so. But that attempt, historical attempt, failed. Of course, it had to fail. Invading China meant a real disaster for the Japanese militarists, for the Japanese government, because there was no end, no prospect of ending the war. And all the atrocities, killings, and how can I say, gush of inhuman instinct, if there is any such thing, even held by poor farmers who are recruited from northeast of Japan and was let loose against the neighboring people who are doing similar things in their own communities, but those people, Chinese farmers, were not considered human beings. No, and military is such a thing, to make men at the time inhuman. And their families also are made inhuman because the wives love their husbands, children love their fathers. Therefore, there's a certain lack of sensitivity, human sensitivity, fostered amongst the ordinary people. That was what I experienced in my childhood. And I myself didn't notice it. I call it colonial mentality, or colonized mentality on the part of the aggressing people. It's not just rulers, not militaries, not soldiers only, but since the military is made the standard of society, people are forced to think likewise. Many people die. In fact, in the series of the war, 3.5 million Japanese died. I would say killed, because they didn't commit suicide. But in spite of that, And in spite of real griefs, private sorrows, people had to endure. And enduring that was praised as a virtue, the proof of greatness, the sacrifice that is accepted in the name of the prosperity of the nation. This kind of mentality in modern Japan started very early and continued until 1945. That is a major question. And we were defeated. It was a miserable defeat. Miserable largely because of the previous pride and confidence they used to have. If you had felt that they were not a strong country, they were just one of the many Asian countries, then the shock wouldn't have been so great. But Japanese, until that time, 1945 or so, felt that they were great. They were the greatest, even. And the emperor, the center of the nation, was holy. It was demigod, God taking the form of human being in a very different way. It's not has nothing to do with the notion of Christian God or sort of monotheic kind of thing, but still God, superhuman. So people are united. And then everything collapsed. And in a single night, in March 10th, intense American bombing killed 100,000 people overnight. I was in Tokyo then, so I experienced all those things. And of course, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. You can see the 10 miles, over 10 miles from just standing on the ground, you can see not horizon, but a very large area because the whole city was flat, burned, smelling. So that was a very precious time for Japan, for us, to be human beings, to really think as a person, as a physical person, as a mental person. We could have thought that things that were wrong, and they did bad things. They should have, and we should have extended our imagination to the people who the Japanese soldiers, Japanese military killed in their villages. Once we experience that suffering, then our imagination normally could reach the sufferings which we brought to the people in the neighboring countries. Did it happen? It happened. Not to some people, but to many people. I should say that. And that was a basis for the resurgence of various movements in that period. Mushrooming of various mass actions, etc., and accusing those who were responsible. But that wasn't shared by the overwhelming majority of the people. the protest was not very shallow in some cases, but mostly the protest was because the rulers gave them this suffering. They started recklessly wars which would end up in defeat. So that was a victim mentality. What we achieved in the past 50 years, 60 years, was the spread of this mentality, peace mentality. We are for peace. We are against nuclear bombs, of course. We are the first country that was victimized by the war use of nuclear energy. So we should call to all the people in the world to fight with us to get it abolished. There's a constitution which was made, and which is a very controversial constitution, yet now a very important weapon for us to struggle with the right-wing, rightist government, which says that we don't have any military forces. Army, Navy, Air Force, and other forms of war potentials are not recognized. Right of belligerency is denied. This kind of very clear, sort of Quaker-like clause is there. Absolute pacifism. We like it. It was made with the original draft was made by the American occupation. Yet in the struggle that followed after the start of the Korean War, after start generally of the Cold War, we used it as a weapon in order to fight against American efforts to remilitarize, to use Japan for American interests, for the world interests, as they say, because they are the hegemonic power and they are the people who are fighting for freedom, democracy, etc. So this peace constitution, so-called, is a sort of, how can I say, the brand name of the post-war Japan. We are for peace, etc., etc. And the movement against nuclear weapons, which developed very broadly, on a broad basis. It still continues. It started in 1954, but that tackles various political problems. Well, what I say interests you because I'm talking about Japan, and Japan is so far away in your mind, and so I wonder. But maybe sort of provision of some new information. I hope is useful. I'm talking about this ambiguous nature of Japan. is it a good country? Is it a country that can really address the very basic problem of the world today? Okinawa is part of Japan now. Okinawa used to be a country, a state, not in the modern sense, not a modern state, but a state of a certain sort, pre-modern state, connected with China. So China regarded Okinawa as one of those tributary countries. Regularly missions are sent and trade was maintained. But the Japanese feudal ruler, particularly in Kyushu area, one of them had special relations with them. And it's like American occupation, in virtual American occupation. It actually stationed its soldiers and from behind machinated the Okinawan state. What Japan did with the beginning of the modern nation was to annex it, simply annex it, and make it part of Japan. That was one of the first aggressive steps the modern Japanese state took. And the Constitution in 1946, it was promulgated in 1946 and was enforced in 1947. When MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied powers stationed in Tokyo, favored totally unarmed Japan. He favored that, and actually he liked it, because he said, if Okinawa is totally controlled by America as the airbase, long-range bombers, then that's enough. That's enough to keep peace in the Far East. So better to keep Japan unarmed. So the peace clause of the Constitution was given in exchange for the permanent occupation of Okinawa with 800,000 people at the time as the American military colony. It was a very ambiguous situation, status, and there's no sort of legal justification for the occupation of Okinawa. So the struggle of the Okinawans against military base is still very strong, and there's no solution. And so the peace constitution, which the mainland Japanese so much appreciate, was in exchange for the occupation and use of Okinawa as American military bases. Well, we call this whole period post-war Japanese state period. The post-war Japanese state is a particular historical term in order to point to what? The characteristic of the Japanese state for some time. You talk about, for instance, Weimar democracy in post-World War I Germany. It's like that. So this is my particular term, post-war Japanese state, which is based on the constitution, which is pacifist, which is democratic. On the other hand, is based on Japan's totally military integration with the United States, military as well as economic. But there was the third factor. The third factor was a little bit clandestine. It shouldn't be openly announced by the government, but it was there, very strongly rooted in the Japanese politics. That is the principle of continuity of the Japanese statehood from the imperial period. The post-war Japanese state openly said that we are different from the previous government. The history is cut in 1945. Yet, the ruling groups had different view. Well, we may have compromised, but we are still we. We are still around the emperor. We are still the holder of the kokutai, which is the mode of the state, the essence of the state. Essence of the state is still there. This is the basis of the right-wing movement and basis of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, which at the bottom of their heart was loyal to this principle, yet couldn't say so openly. Because if it says so, that you have to justify all the wars in the past. Invasion of China was for the protection of the Japanese national interests, at least Manchuria, and northern part of China. That is was a necessary thing, and nothing wrong because all other countries, other imperialist countries are doing the same thing, and why not us? Everything had to be justified. The mistake was that they started war with America, knowing that America is superior. So there were three principles of the state around which the state is supposed to be organized. Three of them are incompatible with each other. Yet the Japanese state had those three in a very, how can I say, interrelated, but not actually interrelated. They are contradictory to each other. So if you really hold one as the principle of this state, then you should deny the other two. But the Japanese state actually embraced the three, as though they were compatible. So sometimes I say that the principle of the post-war Japanese state is opportunism. That is a contradictory thing because opportunism is just the opposite to principle. So that means no principle. Well, there was antagonism, and progressives and conservatives. Progressives led by the Socialist Party, Communist Party, and intellectuals who are largely Marxist. One interesting thing is that in post-war Japan, intellectual world was dominated by Marxism of one or the other type. So those three elements were together and formed a reformist camp, which opposed itself to the conservative camp, and politics evolved around that axis. But that situation changed. That situation changed, and in middle of 1990s, 95 or so, the rightists upholding the third principle, the principle of continuity, they came to the fore. They formed an alliance, the united front of all the rightists, and formed Japan Conference, which is the proper name of the organization. Abe was the prince of that movement. And they were against the constitution. They want to change it and want to make emperor head of the state. Emperor now is symbol of the state and the unity of the people. Symbol is a very vague expression, and so it is prohibited from doing any kind of political activities. But there's very interesting development, which is that the emperor himself has become critical of Abe's approach of reviving the past statehood. But anyway, this is what is happening. And this means that using all channels, efforts to justify what Japan did in the past is carried out. And it has a prominent effect, and the power is used in order to intimidate media. And so media, by and large, follow that line, although what they say sometimes are critical, but when they say truly critical, pressure is there. And the business circle is behind this move, and therefore no advertisement for media that are critical, kind of thing. And so this is what is happening. And the people are critical of this whole move. But and we actually mobilize hundreds of thousands of people gather in 2016, 2015, 16, and now we are pushing in order to overthrow this government. But the question of colonialism doesn't enter our mentality. So we are against the revision of the constitution. That is the main thing. But it was when the struggle was going on that the Korean crisis occurred. But the constitution movement didn't react to it. Instead, the parliament unanimously carried a resolution denouncing North Korea. And even the Communist Party joined it. So there's a sort of national unity built around that question. And the Japanese government is now playing a sort of provocative agency, opposing any kind of compromise, and the maximum pressure alone is the policy of the Japanese government on the Korean issue. So Japan is totally isolated in international politics, particularly after this U.S.-North Korea reconciliation is taking place. Well, so this is a problem we have. So we haven't solved it yet. But we should clearly put the problem and the importance of it in front of the people, and we ourselves should find ways to change that mentality of the people. And we do have a very strong and persistent movement working along that line, like movement on comfort women issue, and Korea Solidarity Movement, International Solidarity Movement, etc., which sees Japan not only from within, but from without, and trying to change ourselves. So I am not despaired. I have hope. But I know how can I say, how sticky this colonial mentality implanted over years and repeatedly infused from above and from below into our minds. That should be admitted. But the way, one way is to let people look at Japan from outside. And that is possible only when people come here, for instance, to talk with the Chinese people, Korean people, who are doing something very important, and find that, well, what you're saying is really true. And we never knew that Korean people are such people, Chinese people are such people. We understand China in terms of tourists who come in large groups and having much money and buy everything, anything. And that is the image China now projects to the ordinary people. Like Japan, say, in the 60s in Paris. So, well, that is, of course, part of China. But people in China are so many and are such people that such an image, the shallow image of China never applies. And so I think occasion like this is very important, to encourage and to create not only sort of movement ties, but also some pool of consciousness which we share. And that pool, I think, should sort of be the precursor for the creation of more tangible, more people-to-people sort of contacts and joint action for shared purposes. Well, I'm very sorry that I just this is a casual talk and not a formal talk, and please forgive me, Kinchi.